This is the moment when Red Dead Redemption 2 became more than a game about cowboys. You can't do anything. Control is taken from you completely. You are forced to sit and watch as Arthur coughs and wheezes and splutters, and there's nothing that you can do to stop it. It is a moment of complete mechanical impotence for the player, and it is really the first time in the game that the player is restricted in what they can do. For the first 2/3 of the game, the mechanical story of Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of mastery. You master Arthur's character and increase his stamina, his health bars, his Deadeye ability. You level up his bond with his horse, which allows it to ride further, faster for longer. You move across the map, uncovering it as you go, checking off legendary creatures as you hunt them for their pelts. You are limited from exploring the entire map until the endgame, but even that restriction is mechanical too. Straying too far into New Austin will see you hounded by bounty hunters before too long. Everything about the mechanical development of Red Dead 2 constructs you, the player, as a force in the world which only gets stronger, until the final act of the story. Arthur and his companions return from Guarma. Arthur's character model has changed, but you never really pay too much attention to it. It is an incidental detail at most, if it is recognised at all. Until, one day, Arthur is minding his own business, perhaps off to meet Sadie Adler, when he falls from his horse. A kindly soul takes him to the doctor, who doesn't need long to diagnose Arthur. It's bad news. Tuberculosis. A death sentence in 1899. He goes about his day, but he knows he can't escape his fate. A little pop-up appears in the top right-hand corner of the screen. From now on, Arthur only gets health benefits from eating certain food, as his health core is reduced. He will never be the man that he was but a few hours previously. It wasn't until the moment beside the destroyed bridge that I understood the lengths that Rockstar went to with this mechanical limitation. It shows remarkable nerve on the behalf of Rockstar that they chose to show this moment in-game, refusing to use the black bars encroaching on the screen to indicate that a non-interactable scene was playing. Because, for all intents and purposes, it is. But everything about the framing tells the player that they should be able to take control of Arthur, have him leap gazelle-like onto his mighty steed and ride into the sunset in pursuit of more adventure. It reveals an admirable level of trust that Rockstar put in the player to understand the narrative point that they were making through the absence of mechanics, a complete removal of power, even if only for a second. This is the moment when Red Dead Redemption 2 became more than a game about cowboys, and the moment that I knew that I was going to make a video all about the mechanics of the game. So, here it is. Red Dead Redemption 2, Mechanizing the West. It is said that there are stories that certain mediums are more disposed to telling. Film can tell certain stories in more effective ways than, say, theatre can. And while no one is asking for me to write 10,000 words on the idea of the medium, I'm not above reeling off a list of examples that seem the most apt to the point I am making. The Lord of the Rings books, while occupying a well-deserved place in literature history, tell a story that I am going to controversially say is better suited to the medium of film, with its big screen ability to literally portray the fantastical landscape of Tolkien's work, and evoke the emotional scope of characters' journeys through its ability to combine music and image. And the fact that the drama of your world-saving quest isn't derailed at least 2 points to pursue the antics of a seemingly all-powerful eccentric who is never seen again and whose all-powerfulness is hand-waved during a sequence that is almost 50 pages of exposition and dialogue between characters who are, again, not seen after this chapter. But you didn't click this video to watch me talk about how the Lord of the Rings books kinda aren't well written and how the films are better in every way. There are certainly things that film doesn't do so well due to the implied realism of the medium itself.
Bloom goes so far, camera right?
Film is a literal representation, and as such there are a lot fewer assumptions that the audience is required to make. The audience isn't expected to work as hard as they are in, say, theatre, because if a film director wants something to be represented on screen, she can more or less do it. Theatre directors can expect theatre audiences to fill in a lot more gaps because of the literal physical limitations of theatre itself.
Immigrants, we get the job done.
Hamilton represents the birth of a country, a civil war, duels, parties, and political and emotional turmoil, using an incredibly pared-back set and almost no props whatsoever. Everything is portrayed using the spoken, sung and rapped word and dance. The Woman in Black uses 3 actors and again a very bare-bones set and props to create its horror.
And it becomes variously a seat on a train, it becomes a carriage for a horse and carriage, it is in an office or a study.
As an audience member, you are asked to imagine the house, its dimensions, what it looks like, and build a picture for yourself. A lot of this is down to the presence of the audience itself and the idea that the audience is as much a part of the conjuring of the fiction that is being represented as the actors are, or the set, or the lighting. The term the fourth wall is often thrown around and is connected to the idea of there being an invisible barrier between the audience and the fiction that is being portrayed. It is most often applied to film and television, where the fourth wall is the literal screen through which you are watching Frodo or Walter White or whoever. As a film or television viewer, you are never really aware of this wall until it is broken. This all gets very technical psychoanalytically here. If you're interested, check out some Christian Metz. But essentially, when the fourth wall is broken in film and television, and to a lesser extent books, the audience is reminded of their existence as an audience. It reminds them that the fiction that they are consuming is exactly that, a fiction. It doesn't exist, no matter how realistic the representation. It is the implied realism of film and television that makes fourth wall breaks so odd, so violating to the viewer. It explains why they are not that common, and when they are used, it is for very specific reasons, usually comic ones.
That's like 16 walls.
But there are notable examples outside of comedy. These instances are used to reinforce thematic explorations with which the fiction is engaging. In this scene, Tyler talks about splicing single frames into unrelated films as part of his job as a projector operator.
Nobody knows that they saw it, but they did.
And throughout Fight Club, random single frames of Tyler appear. In film and television, fourth wall breaks are an exception.
What a pisser.
In theatre, they are a part of the language of the medium itself. This goes all the way back to ancient Greek theatre with the Greek chorus, a body of actors who give the audience information about the setting, the context and history of the characters in the play itself. The information is often not presented as part of the diegesis of the play itself, meaning that it is understood by the audience that the chorus are operating outside of the fiction, whereas the actors of the play, everything they say and do are part of the diegesis, i.e. they are operating within the fiction. The Greek chorus operated as a sort of go-between, between the fiction of the play itself and the audience, filling in any gaps that it doesn't make sense for the drama to plug itself. More recently, you have dramatic soliloquy, which most people will recognise from the plays of William Shakespeare, Old Bill Shaky, and which are different from monologues because they are often representations of a character's feelings or motivations spoken aloud and to the audience, whereas a monologue is just words spoken aloud by one character, a dialogue is words spoken by 2 characters, etc.
Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York.
Richard, or Gloucester as he is known at this point in the play, is directly addressing the audience, giving them the historical context of the play and setting the general scene, filling the role that would have been occupied by the Greek chorus a couple thousand years earlier. Different mediums have different tools to convey meaning, whether that be different visual language, narrative style, conventions, and so on. We have only discussed film and television so far, with a bit of theatre and literature thrown in for good measure. But what similarities and what differences can we draw between these ancient established mediums and that upstart crow, the video game? Chapter 2. Show me the video games. Video games are an audio-visual medium like theatre and cinema and television, but unlike any of these mediums, video games are the only medium that actively requires the audience's participation to bring the game to life, to animate the fiction of the world, to push the narrative, whatever that may be, to its conclusion. You choose your film on Netflix, press play, and the film will happen regardless of whether you are paying attention or not. Film, television, and literature too, their fiction is fixed. It doesn't change. You can read Hamlet a million times, and everyone still dies at the end.
After a week of fighting, a young man in a red coat stands on a parapet.
Theatre, on the other hand, for all the reasons that we have just seen, is different. It is still an audio-visual medium, certainly, but the existence of the audience within the same physical space as the fiction is being created gives more of an active, participatory aspect to their role.
Hello, would you like to change religions? I have a free book written by Jesus!
We have seen a few of these examples, such as the physical limitations of the theatre requiring the audience to work with the actors in creating an image of the house, court, field, wherever the action on the stage is playing out. And this is all before considering the more literal participations, like in pantomime, with the "he's behind you, oh no he's not, oh yes he is" call and response convention. Mostly, the audience doesn't have to actively participate, their mere presence is enough. In the Woman in Black stage play, there is a moment where the woman herself walks through the stalls and up onto the stage. Her physical proximity to the audience helps create the sense of tension and horror that leaks out of the entire work. The physical space of the theatre is tiny. It's one of the first things people remark upon when they enter the auditorium, and this sense of closeness to the action on the stage helps to bring the audience into the action as well, and is an effect that really cannot be replicated nearly as well in the cinema, no matter how big the screen or how dark the room is, or how impressive the sound system. The audience, their presence, means that no two productions of any play, The Woman in Black, Hamlet, fucking Cats, will ever be exactly the same, unlike film. Stage actors will always say that they get different vibes off of their audience and that they might inflect words differently from night to night, might move in a more sinister way tonight, might amble around in a less precise way tomorrow. All of this is part of the excitement of the theatre, the idea that that production on the night you are there will always be for you, because it will never be the same for tomorrow's audience or yesterday's audience. It will be uniquely yours forever.
And I believe that in 1978 God changed his mind about black people. Black people! You can be a Mormon who just believes. What the this?
With a video game, the player is both audience, they witness the events of the game, they consume the narrative that is being unfolded in front of them, but they are also one of the actors, a participant in the drama. In their simplest role, players literally make the game happen, triggering events that are fixed in the narrative. Gordon Freeman will always cause the Residence Cascade, Link will always defeat Ganon. Nevertheless, no two playthroughs of Half-Life or Ocarina of Time will literally be the same, though there will be tiny differences. If you were to record a playthrough of either and then record a second playthrough, the film, if you like, of both would be shorter or longer. One playthrough the player might decide to go straight to Hyrule Castle, in the other they might decide to wander off and explore the wide world. Players bring the games into existence in a much more literal and physical way than theatre audiences do, and certainly more than cinema audiences do. And I'm using examples of games from 25 years ago here, although admittedly they are pretty sterling examples of what gaming could do narratively and mechanically at the time. We have had decades of innovation and evolution in that time in terms of computer graphics, algorithms, physics modelling, and the jump from this to this in less than my lifetime is nothing short of astounding. The player is central to the video game, and the systems that developers build into their games to allow the player to interact with their worlds are called mechanics. Now, mechanics are literally anything that you can do in a particular game world. To use Half-Life 2, for example, we have movement mechanics, jumping, swimming, vaulting, etc., combat mechanics, physics mechanics, driving mechanics, healing mechanics, and that is all without considering the more nuanced stuff, like mechanics where aiming for particular parts of an enemy will do more damage. Half-Life 2 is still great 15 years later, but it is nevertheless incredibly basic, mechanically speaking. You essentially run through linearly designed levels shooting things. Take a game like Skyrim, however, and the number of mechanics that that game offers to the player increases exponentially. Aside from the ones that are present in both Half-Life 2 and Skyrim, you have an in-game currency, a conversation tree with branching options, a whole magic side to the combat, stealth mechanics, weather systems, artificial intelligence that governs NPCs and their schedules, etc., stamina, an inventory system, a three-dimensional map, fast travel, skill trees, weapon upgrade trees, a loyalty system, and this is all before considering the game's story, the quest system, branching quests, choosing allegiances, and the impact that has on the world itself, freaking dragons, and crafting. Skyrim came out almost exactly 7 years after Half-Life 2, which itself came out 6 years after Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Games are fucking complex pieces of software, and all the systems that are built into them allow the player to engage with the game world to increasing levels of nuance and complexity. Skyrim was a game changer for open worlds, setting the bar for what game is expected to be able to do within game worlds, and similarly, how they expected the worlds to react to their presence within it. Player choice is such a loaded term in gaming, but I think I can safely say that the greater the amount of player choice, or, let's be honest, from an algorithmic level, the greater the illusion of player choice, the better. And this is all governed by the depth, complexity, and sheer variety of game mechanics. Luckily, Red Dead Redemption 2 has got you covered. To name just a few, you have cover mechanics, different types of ammo, horse mechanics, a somewhat bewildering health system that is used for both Arthur and his steed, an honour system, hunting, and within that a system that awards pelts of different quality to the player depending on what weapons they use to kill said animal, fishing with different sets of lures and baits that are used to attract different types of fish, an in-game currency, weapon upgrade systems, just a whole bunch of outfits rolled up inside a clothing system that governs what Arthur can wear in different climates, weather systems, a lovely little railroad with schedules and trains that you can rob, mini-games such as poker and blackjack. Oh, I haven't mentioned the game's actual story yet, which builds on decisions to be made at key moments that affect how the game ends, side missions, stranger missions, treasure hunts, challenges that unlock clothing from the trapper, and inevitably crafting systems. Arthur's hair and beard grow over time, so you have to keep them trimmed, and you can take a tonic that makes them grow faster. NPCs will react to Arthur differently, whether he is bathed recently or not. Then there are the legendary animals and fish to hunt for unique outfits, horses to break and sell, and last, and I'm missing out on a whole bunch of things here, there are the mechanics that pop up like once or twice and are never seen again, like replacing a wagon wheel on its axle, or shepherding sheep, or flying a hot air balloon. Red Dead Redemption 2 might be the most mechanically dense and ambitious game that has ever been created. It is one thing to build all of these mechanics into a game. It is completely another thing to design them in the way that Rockstar have that creates overlap between all of these mechanics. Engaging in one usually means engaging with others. Let me give you an example.
This better be good. It is good.
Red Dead Redemption 2 is hardly unique in having a health system. Now, Rockstar could quite easily have used a simple regeneration system that restores health over time and used first aid kits to restore large amounts of health quickly. But Rockstar's vision of a realistic Western story means that health is restored by eating food, like tins of delicious cold beans. Some food restores health but decreases stamina. Immediately there is overlap, and maintaining your health cores becomes a case of managing all three of your cores: health, stamina, and Deadeye. Smoking a cigar boosts your Deadeye core but damages your health, for instance. Better quality food, like meat, restores your health more than other food, so that idea pushes the player into interacting with the hunting mechanics, and the cooking mechanics, and the foraging mechanics, because meat and herbs can be combined to create superfoods that do all sorts of lovely things to your cores. Eat too much food and Arthur will gain weight, eat too little and he'll become a scrawny waif like me. When the unfortunate event occurs, Arthur has to eat twice as much food because it has half of the benefit. Pursuing just this one line of exploration that began with talking about the simple act of healing in Red Dead Redemption 2 brings in 4 or 5 other mechanics which themselves act as the jumping off point to bringing still more of the game's mechanics into the mix. Hunting for pelts introduces the idea of using different weapons with different types of ammunition to kill specific animals, which in turn mixes in Red Dead's in-game currency and the idea of a gameplay rhythm that organically moves the player through the world, from going out into the wilderness to hunt elk, to taking your elk skins into town to sell, to going back out hunting again, to going back to camp to maybe upgrade Arthur's wagon, or get that bison skull for Pearson that he's had his eye on for a while, which in turn leads the player past quest givers, which takes Arthur out of camp and into the wilderness, or a town, or a city, and the cycle starts again. And it doesn't take long for this gameplay rhythm to become internalized so that it becomes natural, informing how the player plans out their progression through the game. It did for me. Perhaps I'll head up into the hills, I would think, maybe hunt for that legendary animal I discovered after I had to escape the law after that bank job in Valentine. And then, a great buck carcass in the bag and heading back into the town to sell to the trapper, maybe I can get a few more rabbit pelts for that satchel that Pearson was going to make for me. When that's done, maybe Javier wants to go fishing, or perhaps Sean has been cooking up another stagecoach job, that old rascal. Individual activities that would otherwise be separated geographically become linked together, the one leading into the next, so that they cease to become a bunch of gameplay mechanics, and instead become the events of a lazy Sunday afternoon in the Old West for Arthur Morgan, one in a long line of Sundays that are quickly running out, whether he knows it or not. We are beginning to see how mechanics are used to affect the way that the player engages with the world on a more psychological level. Part of this is down to the setting. The Old West of Red Dead 2 allows for a much more ground-level engagement with the game's mechanics and themes than, say, the Grand Theft Auto series does. The 20th century settings of Liberty City and Los Santos, combined with the emphasis on high-speed traversal of these locations in a variety of vehicles, from motorcycles to high-end sports cars to helicopters and jet planes, means that the player has a very different relationship with the landscape as seen through a windshield than the one seen from horseback. Vice City is a much more ephemeral place than Saint-Denis, and this has nothing to do with the graphical limitations of its engine, the experience of the city being more often than not a blur of neon lighting and heat haze rapidly replaced by more neon. How much of any of the Grand Theft Auto games can anyone really say they encountered at ground level as a pedestrian? Grand Theft Auto as a series engenders an impatience and attention deficit disorder in players, and facilitates it by designing the game so that the player is literally never more than 5 seconds away from stealing a car and returning to the pace and point of view that those games are meant to be enjoyed from, a million miles an hour and behind a steering wheel. The hypermanic modes of play that Grand Theft Auto pushes divorces players from the reality of the world through which they are playing. This is entirely the point. The Grand Theft Auto series is a parody of our 20th and 21st century lifestyles. It needs to create more distance between the player and that which is being satirised because the satire is so overblown that if the two were any closer the joke just wouldn't work. This critical distance between the player and the landscapes of GTA creates a paradoxical situation where the increasing graphical capabilities of Rockstar's Rage engine, from GTA 3 to Vice City to San Andreas to 4 to 5, does not map with the player's engagement with those worlds as real places. San Andreas in GTA 5 was one of the most complex depictions of urban spaces that had ever been seen in gaming. But the tone and pace of the game did not mean that the player's engagement with that world was any more realistic than in GTA 3. San Andreas is a playground with all these activities laid out all over the map, and the player can choose to participate in them or not until they get bored or pursue that activity so far that there isn't any further to go. The Old West in Red Dead Redemption 2 is more like a model, a scale diorama with all the little pieces arranged and fitting to scale with everything else. If the GTA series spends the bulk of its time in Top Gear with the top down on the freeway, with the wind whipping your hair and the landscape a brown blur at the edges of your vision, Red Dead Redemption 2 plays much more like an adagio, thoughtful, ponderous, in no real rush to go, well, anywhere. The landscape of Red Dead Redemption 2 is a lot more open, a lot flatter than the concrete jungles of Los Santos and Liberty City, which is to be expected, so even when you are pushing your mighty steed at full chat through the heartlands or the bayous, it never really feels that you are moving that fast. The default speed for your horse seems to be a smart gallop, not too fast or too slow. I can imagine meetings upon meetings where the only topic of conversation was exactly how fast a player should be able to move through the world. But, and I'm just speaking for myself here, I never felt that I wanted to speed from one side of the map to the other, hoovering up all of the side quests and main story missions one after the other, bang, 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 in the same way that a first-person shooter game might be structured, for instance, one level after the next until the game is done. Red Dead Redemption 2 made me want to linger, and this is what I mean when I talk about the way that the game uses its mechanics to have a psychological effect on the player. Rockstar designed all of its mechanics to be a certain way, and more crucially, animated them to be a particular way too, and there is no better example of this than poker. I have never been too much of a poker player. Sure, I've had 1 or 2 all-nighter sessions in friends' living rooms playing for chewing gum or Monopoly money or whatever replacements for real money we would care to use. I still get confused between spades and clubs, for goodness sake, and even now I wouldn't be able to guarantee you I could tell the difference if £1 million relied on it. It would be fair to say that I have spent more time playing digital poker in the saloons and dusty railroad stations of Red Dead Redemption 2 than I have in my actual real life, which is an odd thing to say when you think about it, because for all the time that it takes to play a hand of poker in Red Dead 2, I may as well have called up my friends and organised a game for real. There is nothing fast or abridged about Red Dead 2's digital rendition of a couple of hands of cards. A dealer still deals out the cards, there's a round of betting, calling, raising, then the river, another round of betting, and then the 4th and 5th cards before everyone turns them over. It is possible to skip the dealing out of new hands, but the screen fades to black and then fades in again to represent the time that has lapsed, and takes about the same length of time as if you just sat there and watched the cards get dealt in real time. Poker in Red Dead 2 is as precise and unhurried as poker is in the real world. Rockstar could have chosen to have their poker minigame play much more similarly to online poker you find around and about, where the whole process is sped up, automated, and not bothered with the time-consuming animations, the little bits of snarky audio between the characters at the table, but, as in the rest of the game, everything about poker in Red Dead 2 is specifically designed to slow the player down. What's the rush, buddy? The game seems to say. It's 1899, it's raining out, and you got no place to be. Take a load off, and keep an eye on old Randy in the corner there. He likes to play with that old wedding band of his when he's bluffing. Poker is only ever encountered once in the main story progression, and even then it's a few hands where your compatriot is looking over your opponent's shoulder and telling you when to bet or fold. For the entire rest of the game, poker is a pursuit, a hobby that Arthur can choose to ignore completely, or find himself dragged into in a lonely storeroom to fill the hours of another empty summer evening. You will never win very much money, or lose too much either, which again is exactly how Rockstar designed it. Poker is not supposed to be used to mechanical advantage, it is to be used to thematic advantage. So much of Red Dead Redemption 2's story is the deep breath before the plunge, the quiet before the storm. Poker becomes part of that inhalation and in many ways can contribute to putting off that storm for as long as the player needs it to. But it can't be put off indefinitely, and I can't put it off anymore. This is a Rockstar game, and for all of Red Dead 2's efforts to create the feeling of an immersive, realistic world to be taken seriously, it can't get away from the tried and true idea of throwing in a bit of good old-fashioned violence to add a bit of drama to your game. I've never liked the combat in Rockstar's games. Maybe it's the third-person perspective and the way that controlling your avatar in these games kind of feels like they've been drinking, but for me, combat has always been a means to an end. The Grand Theft Auto games are at their core driving games. You drive a car, bicycle, plane, helicopter, whatever to a mission, and then you drive another vehicle within that mission, and then you drive to the next mission. Combat invariably happens within these missions, but it never felt to me as though it was the reason for these games to be existing in the first place. You can see this in the mechanics themselves. The Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead games were designed from first principles as console games, and the auto-lock feature, where an analog stick is tweaked to switch from target to target, is Rockstar recognising that third-person shooting, and first-person shooting for that matter, is kinda hampered by the dual-stick system that console controllers use. It is a lot easier to simulate the frenetic, fast-paced nature of a firefight by designing a mechanic that makes a player feel like they are dictating the speed of that combat. And on a console at least, that can really only be achieved with a lock-on feature, the analog stick providing a very poor, slow, cumbersome shooting experience compared to the precise, quick, sharp aiming that a mouse can offer. For me, combat in Rockstar games is there to make the player feel like a rootin' cowboy or a South Central gangster or Scarface or a Goodfella or whoever. It is thematic rather than being itself textual. It is not pleasurable to use of itself. I mean, just think about the way that Red Dead 2 handles its shooting compared to, say, Doom. It's difficult to describe the way that Doom feels without sounding wanky, but I'll lean into it. The shooting in Doom is like touching silk. You just want to touch more silk, right? You wind and twist it through your fingers of one hand, and then you do the same with the fingers of the other hand. It is smooth, it feels good, and you begin to wonder whether it would be practical to only wear silk clothes from now on. Shooting in Red Dead Redemption 2 is like trying to roll a coin between your knuckles, like Jack Sparrow does in objectively the only good Pirates of the Caribbean movie. I guess it looks impressive, but when you are the one actually making it happen, it feels clunky and awkward and serves no actual purpose. Luckily, Red Dead Redemption 2 is all about theme, and Rockstar spent a lot of time thinking about how they could use the combat mechanics to support that theme, rather than just spunk out any old system. When you're firing your revolver, for instance, you click once to fire and then click again to pull back the hammer and rotate the cylinder before another click and you fire again. It's the same when you're firing one of your repeating rifles, one click to fire, one click to reload, one click to fire again. It is a mechanical nod to the real-world practicalities of operating these weapons. It isn't the firing of the weapon that deepens the player's link with the world on their screen, it's the reloading. A weapon that doesn't need to be reloaded would break the immersion in the world. It just wouldn't be realistic. The idea of using ammunition and reloading mechanics as another tool to cement the player's relationship with the game world and its characters isn't new to Red Dead. To use Doom again, the pistol has theoretically unlimited ammunition, but quite a long cooldown if overused, which means that using the pistol becomes a resource that the player has to monitor constantly. It never needs reloading, but there will always be a period where it is unusable. It's the same with weapons that have an overheating mechanic attached to them. It's just another thing that the player has to manage, along with health, enemy placement, weak points, environment, etc. The Gears of War games use a little minigame when reloading the Lancer rifle, where a quicker reload time and bonus damage is rewarded if the player presses the reload button to stop a moving line inside certain shaded areas on a meter. It's tiny little details like this that can elevate the combat mechanics from being functional to being an indispensable part of the player's entry into the world. I don't remember a huge amount about the Gears of War games, but God knows that I remember the feeling of getting a perfect reload and the gravelly tones of Marcus Phoenix muttering to himself.
Nice!
Red Dead's reloading mechanics, tiny little details in a game that is awash with tiny little details, is an example of just one way in which the player can interact with what are quite common ideas to games to the greatest thematic or narrative effect, and all of this without a shot being fired. Red Dead Redemption 2 feels like the least rockstar-y game of anything that the studio has made in regard to the emphasis that the game places on combat and shooting. There are plenty of story missions, stranger missions, side quests that don't have any shooting or combat mechanics at all, particularly in the long, lazy summer of the game's opening hours. I'm talking for myself here because I'm about to get into something that is incredibly subjective, but which I think is nevertheless a testament to the attitude that Rockstar have taken to the world of Red Dead 2. I never got into fights outside of the main missions, at all. There were occasional times when I was trotting my noble steed through town in search of a bath or a shave, where the tricksy movement controls would suddenly veer me into a collision with an NPC, and suddenly everyone is getting very upset and the pistols are coming out. I never engaged with these completely random encounters, not once. I put the spurs to my horse and sped right on out of town. Now, this is partly down to the fact that I don't actually like the combat mechanics in Rockstar games, but it's principally down to my complete credulousness when accepting the realism of the world I was playing through, and through that, my utter acceptance of Arthur as a real living, breathing character. It's such a cliche to use those words, so flimsy, so passé, real, living, breathing character indeed. All Arthur is a happy combination of ones and zeros deep inside a computer algorithm, in the same way that all Harry is letters on a page arranged in pleasing combinations, or Grieg's piano concerto in A minor is a whole bunch of notes arranged in the right order. Arthur is there in the game's code, waiting to be brought to life, and he will be brought to life by each individual player in their own individual ways. My Arthur was an outlaw, yes. Rough around the edges, yes. He'd made mistakes in his past, yes. That was who Arthur was. It is the player's role to make Arthur who they want him to be. I decided that my Arthur was a good man, ultimately, honest when he could be, and never revelled in the bloodletting that swelled around him, and which was never far off in his immediate future. But I made sure that he was never the first person to shoot, that he never did the things that he did unprovoked, that his victims were always deserving of the justice that he meted out to them, lawfully or otherwise. This is why my Arthur rode away from fights if his invisible sky god's finger accidentally slipped. I became so invested in Arthur's character as the game presents him to the player, but my investment was deepened by my immersion in the astounding beauty of the world of New Austin and Lemoyne, the Heartlands and Saint Denis. The realism I saw conjured onto my screen by pieces of silicon and hot dyes in turn made me project that realism back onto Arthur, and from there my relationship with the game took on new and profound meanings. A game's graphical qualities can be as much of a mechanic itself as health or combat mechanics can be, and just as important in terms of throwing open the door to the player and beckoning them inside. It's something that you see throughout visual media, the visual style informing the level at which an audience or player engages with the fiction that is being presented. Lindsay Ellis touches upon this a lot in her videos, particularly in her work on the movie adaptations of Cats and The Phantom of the Opera in the context of movie musicals.
It's over now, the music of the night.
She charts the rise and fall of the movie musical, noting the popularity of the form in the 50s and 60s, with Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music being exemplars of the form.
Cheeky.
She argues that the Hollywood musical fell out of favour after the release of Hello Dolly in 1969. and that it has never really regained the ground that it enjoyed in its heyday, suggesting that the shift towards an emphasis on gritty realism in the 90s and the aughts meant that musicals on the big screen could never again be framed in the way that best suited the medium. The hyperrealism adopted by Tom Hooper in his adaptation of Les Mis, for instance, sits uncomfortably alongside the nature of the material from which it is drawing. There is a disconnect between the framing of the action, everything about the camera, how it moves and where the characters move within that frame, and the actual action itself. The audience are being shown one thing, but being told another. This is a problem with adaptation in general. Stage musicals ask something of an audience that they can't ask in a cinema without breaking the rules, if you like, that the medium of film sets out. It's also a problem with the state of Hollywood filmmaking as it stands in the early 21st century. Oscar-worthy films have to look a certain way. In 2020, your movie is much more likely to win a gong if it deals with social themes, as in Parasite, Green Book and Moonlight, is some sort of historical drama, as in Spotlight and 12 Years a Slave, Argo and The King's Speech, or has a dog in it, as in The Artist. These are weighty movies with wrought themes and narratives, and the cinematography and directorial style reflects this. This is a marked difference from what the Academy were looking for in the 60s. One musical has won Best Picture this century, Chicago in 2002. 4 won Best Picture in a single decade, West Side Story, My Fair Lady, The Sound of Music and Oliver in the 60s.
I think I'd better think it out again.
Les Mis, Phantom, Cats, these are big budget operations, business ventures first, artistic ventures second, much more so than theatre or musicals, which have very different economic priorities. Movies have a much shorter time frame within which to make their money back, and one of the best ways you can achieve this as a studio wanting to make a big profit is by ensuring that your film can be deemed Oscar-worthy. And this means making something that looks like this on the stage.
Do you hear the people sing, singing the song of angry men?
Look like this on film.
Do you hear the people sing, singing the song of angry men?
In the early 21st century, the musical more readily translates into a medium that uses a visual style that may not negate realism per se, but certainly doesn't strive for the photorealism that can be achieved by a film camera mediating real life. When you are grounded in reality, the camera is similarly grounded too, and isn't free to leave the world of mundanity behind and head into the heavens of fantasticality, to invent a word. And I mean this literally too. In an animated film, you don't have to worry about the practical limitations of such bothersome things as gravity and physics and all of that dull stuff. You can have your virtual camera wherever you want, you can have it do whatever you want it to do, and this fact itself allows a director to convey a sense of otherworldliness, a sense of magic, a sense of wonder that the musical as a form really demands. The stage musical is already demanding a suspension of disbelief from the audience by the fact that all of the action is happening in the same physical space as the viewer, so it follows that it is a lot easier to just keep going with the suspension and really double down on it in terms of what you can show. The animated musical is exactly the same. In its very visual representation, it is asking the audience to kind of just accept it, and in this acceptance, by going along with the fact that this isn't supposed to be real life, the audience are already primed to accept other things, like castles conjured from ice, or painting with all the colours of the wind, or talking crabs, or singing teapots. And singing teapots brings me back to Red Dead Redemption 2 in an appallingly forced segue, because the whole idea of the pursuit of realism in your chosen visual medium informing the way that your audience engages with the images on the screen is just as relevant to video games as it is to film. Borderlands' use of the cel-shaded style gives the game a wacky, cartoony look that supports the irreverent tone that the game adopts. The 1950s aesthetic of Fallout 4 supports the bittersweet longing for the innocence of an America that hasn't been destroyed by nuclear Armageddon. The bright, colourful splashiness of Doom 2016 foregrounds the player's mechanical engagement with the world, as opposed to striving for any realistic depiction of terraformed Mars and the plains of hell. The same is the case for Red Dead Redemption 2. Rockstar chose to make the game look this way. There is nothing accidental about it. The realistic visual style, almost photorealism in some places if you have a powerful enough machine, forces the player to accept everything at face value because, well, there it is. Here are some woods. Here is a bustling turn-of-the-century city. Here are some snowy mountains. Look, watch as your horse leaves a trail behind you as you go. This realism is projected onto the player, and in return the player projects this realism back onto the screen. Red Dead Redemption 2 frames itself as a simulation in its attempts at fidelity to the real world that you or I see out of our windows, and this subconsciously reinforces an expectation in the player that they should engage with the game in as realistic a way as possible. This filters right down to how Arthur Morgan is encountered by the player, in fact how any of the characters in Red Dead are encountered by the player. The near photorealism helps in the suspension of disbelief that anyone has to participate in when engaging with any media. For me, Arthur, Dutch, Hosea, Abigail, John, Lenny, Charles were all as real as the most enduring, complex characters that you might find in the best serial television drama today. Arthur ranks up there along with Tony Soprano and Walter White. He is as much a victim of his circumstances, though it was beholden to me, the player, to what extent Arthur would cede control to his fate or try to fight it. At the climax of the game, Arthur's horse is felled during the climactic flight from the inevitable, but Arthur still finds time to calm the injured beast in its last moments. Arthur and I had had that horse from the beginning of the game, and we had gone through much together. Wherever Arthur and I went, our horse was never far behind. Like all the relationships in the game, the bond between Arthur and his steed is strengthened, deepened, and, for me at least, its last few moments cut me the same as the death of Hosea or Lenny. Arthur's character is the key to the Red Dead Redemption 2 experience. The level at which you engage with his character dictates the way that you experience the rest of the game. There are a number of systems and mechanics working together to shape how Arthur's character is presented to the player, but none is more important than the camp mechanic. Imagining Red Dead Redemption 2 without the constant presence of the Van der Linde camp, a safe haven in the raging storm that is the end of the 19th century, is to imagine a completely different game. Narrative is as good a place to start as any, and while I won't go too far into it, a few of the key points need to be repeated to understand exactly what I'm saying here. Red Dead Redemption 2 is about the end of the cowboy, and the end of an entire way of life, the arrival of a new century, and all of the modernisation and civilization that it heralded.
We're more ghosts than people.
These things are inevitable, inexorable, but no less feared and mistrusted by our main characters for it. The Van der Linde gang are driven ever eastwards, a location that is repeatedly coded as standing for everything that the Van der Linde gang isn't.
I can't believe we're going to see civilization.
The Pinkertons come from the east, New York precisely. There is a moment when Arthur chaperones a completely lost man into Strawberry, his hapless companion having travelled west in search of adventure and excitement. Saint Denis, the biggest city in Red Dead 2's world, and crucially the easternmost point on the game's map, is framed in its first canon encounter as dirty, unnatural, an abomination on the face of the world after the clean air and open spaces of the Heartlands. As they are hounded further and further away from the west, the gang crumbles, fractures, the rosy summer days of Horseshoe Overlook, a far cry from the gang's last moments in the grey, shadowy crags of Beaver's Hollow. The final encampment sits at the edge of a cave, its black mouth representing oblivion, an unknown, death, an end. As the gang is driven further and further east, the player similarly spends more and more time in the areas in the easternmost parts of the map. A mechanical movement away from a life that is dead, the dream of which is still clung to by the characters, the hope attached to such clinging gradually withering and dying as the game progresses. Without the camp mechanics, say, with the game being centred around a lone Arthur as he moves through the world, making few attachments with no responsibility to anybody, the entire narrative and thematic drive of the game is lost. A lone Arthur, pursued by the Pinkertons, has no reason not to just disappear, hang up his pistols, accept his metaphorical death and embrace a new life instead, a character conflict that is best embodied by his relationship with Mary Linton.
You came!
Yeah, I came.
At numerous points in the game, Mary begs Arthur to run away with her. Their love for each other is genuine, and I wish that the game gave Arthur, the option to go with her, to jump on the train with her and free himself from the prison he was born into.
Got some people I need to take care of. But once they're free, then I'm free. Then I can disappear.
It would have been a nice touch for there to have been an option, greyed out perhaps, a choice forever open to Arthur but forever out of his reach. Maybe even Red Dead 2 wasn't ready for this meta playing with the audience's expectations. A lone Arthur has every reason to go with Mary. The Arthur with his own adopted family, with Jack, John and Abigail to think of, with a life debt to Hosea and, yes, Dutch, that will never be paid, can never be paid, will never leave.
I'm coming with you.
The Van der Linde gang are the beating heart of the Red Dead Redemption 2 experience, both thematically and mechanically. Mary Beth, Pearson, Lenny, Charles, these characters are the human faces of a way of life that they believe, however naively, can be preserved. It is interesting to think about how Red Dead 2 goes about characterising its protagonist and antagonists the further away they get from Arthur, both geographically and philosophically. Red Dead 2 largely removes the more wacky characters that have, in my opinion, plagued Rockstar's games for the last 2 decades or so, and instead chooses to ground its human faces much more firmly in reality. This isn't to say that the game completely omits moments of craziness, but they are few and far between, and no less jarring for that. There is the Stranger mission where Arthur harnesses the power of lightning to bring an inventor's robot child to life, and then there is the time where you have to find a circus performer's escaped animals, which aren't quite what they seem in the end.
Sod you, Daddy, I said. I'm going to America to make it on the stage.
And who can forget the adventure of the dwarf magician who Arthur has to chase around a forest? It has to be said though, these encounters are entirely optional and still mercifully spread out across what can easily be a 100-hour game. So they feel more like little palate cleansing episodes as opposed to the encounters with Nigel West Dickens and Seth in the original Red Dead Redemption. All of the examples I've described are discovered geographically distant from the camp, which is what I mean when I say that the further away you get, the less realistic and grounded the characterization is.
All right, madam.
It's bloody Margaret, not madam.
As Arthur, you spend a lot of time in camp, the slow movement speed that is forced upon the player encouraging them to pay more attention to what is going on around them. The amount of detail that has gone into making the Van der Linde camp seem alive, a breathing organism as opposed to a static quest-giving hub, is astounding. Characters will have entire conversations and go about their own little chores entirely independently of whether the player is there to see them or not. They will joke and tell stories around the campfire, bicker amongst themselves, argue in their tents in the middle of the night when they think everyone is asleep, to the point where there were times when I would just stand in the middle of the camp and listen to what was going on around me. At a few points, the camp gathers to celebrate recent events that the player has just participated in, and there is drinking and dancing and singing.
No stopping you, Karen.
You better believe it.
Javier strikes up a tune on the guitar and Karen launches into a lusty tune about buxom bar wenches or some such nonsense. The night progresses and the drink flows and emotions run high. The drink gets the better of Pearson and Bill Williamson gets violent because in the end these are rough people living rough lives and some disputes can only be solved with fists. By the end of the night, there might still be one lonely voice carried on the wind trying to keep the party going, but for most, bed has long since beckoned and the sun is just kissing the eastern horizon. And you can skip all of it. In my first playthrough after the rescue of Sean, sure, my Arthur had a few beers, but the rest of the game beckoned and time waited for no man, so Arthur turned in for the night and carried on to his inevitable doom.
Oh, a cynic.
But I hadn't properly begun to engage with the game on the level it wanted me to enjoy it at. As the hours went by and I grew to know the characters, I grew to like them more, finding that Arthur's fondness for them only deepened. When Jack is rescued from Bronte and the gang decide to knock back a few jars and sing the songs of the old country, I lingered. Arthur joined in with the songs and talked to everybody, sharing jokes with those by the campfire and encouraging those lurking at the edges to join in the fun. The idea of mechanically rewarding the player for completing a level or defeating a boss is so deeply ingrained that it is at once such an obvious thing to say that it borders on obtuseness, and is also kind of harming to our idea of what game design can do. We expect new weapons as we progress through games, larger health pools, the ability to double jump. Red Dead Redemption 2 disagrees. The camp parties are narrative rewards for reaching milestones. The player is gifted with opportunities to learn more about why they should care about the characters in the game, why they should care about the story, why they should care about engaging with the game at all. There are no mechanical benefits after saving Sean and Jack respectively, not least as far as I know, beyond moving the game's narrative to the next stage. Your horse can't inexplicably run further, faster and for longer, the amount of stuff Arthur can carry in his satchel doesn't magically double, he can't reload his weapons 10% faster or do 5% more damage with each bullet, but the player learns more about Hosea, Lenny, Molly, and this reward pays dividends hours further down the road when the unfortunate events really begin to rack up. Engaging with this aspect of the camp mechanic doesn't reward the player with more gameplay options per se, it rewards them with a greater appreciation for the gameplay options that have already been established. The extent to which you pay attention to these tiny details of the Vandalin Camp's system informs the extent to which you are able to engage emotionally with the tale Red Dead 2 weaves, which itself dictates how seriously the player engages with the characters in the game, and so on in an unbroken circle, an Ouroboros of gameplay mechanics and narrative drive and emotional success. After the party to celebrate Sean's return in my first playthrough, I made sure to drink in as much of the atmosphere and little pieces of world building and character development that were integrated into these moments, but I've seen a number of posts on forums where people just said that they went to sleep or went off into the wilderness to carry on with the actual game. This is fine, everyone will have their own engagement with Red Dead 2, and I guess it is a mark in Rockstar's favour that they didn't force these particular story moments on players by making it impossible for them to leave. It makes times where all the characters come together for the briefest of moments, snatching a last gasp of a life that is rapidly receding, seem that much more special, and when you experience it as a player, it feels like the developer designed the chance character moments in the shadows at the edge of the fireside just for you. Tiny details are what elevate Red Dead Redemption 2, and the fact that they can be missed gives them that much more weight. Real life is made up of millions of details, moments, chance looks that flash into existence as quickly as they flash out again. Red Dead Redemption 2 reflects these straight back at the player. Way back at the beginning of this video, we began by talking about how mediums are suited to telling certain stories. We've had interludes talking about musicals and the difficulties of translating them from their birthplace on the stage to their troubled foster home of the screen. If we accept that each medium, film, television, literature, poetry, video games, etc., is better at telling certain stories than others, it follows then that there are stories that each medium can only tell. Imagine trying to compress the story of Breaking Bad, or The Wire, or The Sopranos with all their richness of theme, denseness of characterization, the highs, the lows, the slow-burning revolution of questions posed and then answered hours later in film. It requires a reframing and reformatting of Walter's story that would patently lose its punch if you had to tell it in 120 minutes instead of 60 hours. Similarly, imagine trying to translate Jaws from a 120-minute movie to a 10-hour miniseries. It could literally be done, but what would be lost in the translation? Red Dead Redemption 2 could only be told in the medium of a video game. We have seen how integral to the story the game's mechanics are, how it supports and reinforces the themes and characterization that make Red Dead 2 the game that it is. Movies can show an impression of what it was like to be in the Old West, but games can put you inside that place, offering a whole new aspect of experience that offers mechanical limitations that push the player into thinking the way that someone would in the Old West. Red Dead Redemption 2 is not a role-playing game in the usual sense, but you undoubtedly play the role of Arthur Morgan, and you can fill in the gaps of his character as you see fit, gaps that the narrative design of the game has deliberately created. Arthur's hair grows as time progresses in the game. You can shave yourself at your little wash basin in camp, but you have to go to a barber to cut your hair and get a really nice close shave. In my second playthrough, I used Arthur's hair as part of my role-playing of Arthur. Before his diagnosis, I played Arthur as ultimately a good man thrust into unfortunate circumstances. He was a bit of a clothes horse and he liked keeping himself looking smart. I would change his outfit between missions, always making sure I stopped into the local store to pick up the latest and most exuberantly coloured threads. Whenever he passed a barber, I always made sure that he got a trim and a shave. He may be an outlaw, but there was no reason he couldn't be a smart, dashing one. After his diagnosis, however, and as the slow inevitability of both his and his adopted family's fate began to approach on the horizon, Arthur's priorities shifted. He let his beard grow out to hide the ravages that the sickness was wreaking on his face. He started to wear a lot more dark clothing. He began to look further and further inside himself as the consequences of his actions began to make themselves known to him, and in response just began to care less and less what face he presented to the world. Arthur does a lot of damage to the people of the New West in Red Dead Redemption 2, both intentionally and unintentionally. I decided that he would aim to right the wrongs that he had caused, that people deserved second chances where all of his many opportunities at a new life had run out. These decisions are not available to the reader or viewer of traditionally fixed media like film and literature. A lot of the history of video games has been about improving graphical capabilities, making them seem as realistic as possible. It has been a period of inward looking as the medium looks at what it can do to itself to make it seem as capable at representing environments and worlds as film is. Video games have even taken on the language of cinema and its use of black bars a la film to indicate cutscenes, lens flare, etc. It is only recently that the medium has started to think about what tools it can offer to players so that they can contribute to the narrative and thematic drive of stories. This is an opportunity unique to video games. Red Dead Redemption 2 is certainly not the first game to do this, but what it undoubtedly is one of the defining games of a generation, certainly of the last decade or so. I touched on this a bit in my last video. Red Dead Redemption 2 will change players' expectations from open worlds in terms of graphical capabilities, in terms of emotional heft, in terms of the storytelling tools that are open to the player. I'm not saying that they should be forced upon players, I'm saying that they should be there for them to pick up if they so choose. So much of my experience of Red Dead 2, so much of what I got out of it, is rooted in the fact that I chose to engage with the game at the level that I did. Red Dead Redemption 2 made the game personal, and it did it all through mechanics.